The orange tags went up on a Tuesday, one staple to every apple tree Della Rourke owned. 70 trees, the whole orchard her grandfather had planted along the south slope, condemned in a single afternoon by a man with a clipboard and a county seal. A borer they called the bronze orchard beetle had been found 3 farms over, its larvae tunneling the living bark of a neighbor's pears. And the quarantine came down on all of Ledford at once. Every orchard was to be felled. Every log was to be stacked. Every stick of it was to be burned before the ground froze so the beetle could not spread another season. There was no appeal on the notice and no allowance for a good tree standing beside a sick one. The county had decided, and the county was in a hurry. For a week, the whole valley smelled of it. Ledford had never been a rich place, and its orchards were the closest thing the hill farms had to money in the bank, and now the hill farms were burning their savings a row at a time and calling it safety. From her slope, Della could see 3 fires at once on a clear evening, orange smears against the dusk. And she understood that every one of them was a family doing exactly as it was told and trusting that the doing would be enough. She did not blame them. She only knew that a fire leaves nothing behind but the smell of what you used to own, and she was not ready to smell her grandfather's orchard on her own clothes for the rest of the winter. By noon, the smoke was already climbing off the Doss place across the road. Cyrus Doss and his grown sons were feeding their trees into a fire the size of a barn, and the whole county could smell the applewood burning for miles. Della stood at her own fence and counted the tags snapping in the cold wind, and she did the only arithmetic that mattered to her. The apples had been her one cash crop. The autumn before, they had brought $400 at the roadside stand and the market together, enough to carry one woman and a handful of animals through to spring. Now the trees were marked to die, and the wood they wanted her to burn was the last thing of any value she had left standing. Everyone in Ledford County was lighting a match that week. Della was the only one who picked up a saw and kept the logs. She was 31 that winter, farming the slope alone since her grandfather passed, and she had learned early that a farm does not forgive a woman who wastes what she is handed. The men across the road did not see waste in a bonfire. They saw the law being obeyed and a nuisance erased. They saw a young woman who had no husband and no money and now no orchard, standing at a fence in a canvas cap and her grandfather's oversized field jacket, refusing to strike a match while the rest of them burned. The inspector's name was Hollis. He came back the following morning to confirm the felling had started, and he found Della already at work with a bow saw, dropping the marked trees one at a time and limbing them clean. He watched her a while before he spoke. When he did, he told her the same thing he had told every orchard on his list. The trees had to come down and the wood had to burn. That was the order. That was how you stopped a beetle like this one. Della kept sawing. She had read the order, she told him, the whole of it, the part the county printed small under the part they said out loud. The order condemned the trees. It forbade any wood from crossing the quarantine line, so the beetle could not ride a load of firewood into a clean county. It did not, anywhere in its careful language, require her to set fire to logs that never left her own land. Burning was the easy disposal. It was not the only lawful one. Hollis frowned at that, but he was an honest man under the clipboard, and when he read his own paper again, he could not point to the line that made her wrong. He told her he would note that her wood was staying on the property inside the line, and that if a single log crossed the road, he would be back with more than a warning. Then he drove off to the next farm. He came back 3 days later with a folded note from the county's own entomologist, which she had not expected. She had made him curious enough to ask upward, and the answer he brought said what she had already read for herself. The beetle spread only when infested wood was hauled to clean ground, where the grown borers could fly to healthy trees. And every orchard in the county was already coming down, which meant that by the summer any grubs might hatch, there would be no living orchard left in Ledford for a beetle to reach. The note set conditions. Her logs had to stay on her land, kept behind fine screen through the next summer's hatch, so that no beetle, which did crawl out, could pass into open air. And open to Hollis's inspection whenever he chose to come. Sealed and inoculated before that hatch and never carried across the line, the condemned wood threatened nothing. Hollis had all of it in writing, and he told her, almost against his will, that he would be back to look. Della went back to her trees. For the rest of that week, she felled 70 apple trees and a short row of old oak along the lane, and she stacked every log in the yard instead of the fire. Her arms shook at night, and her palms blistered through her gloves, and every evening the smoke of her neighbors' fires drifted over the ridge and settled in her hair while she worked past dark. She knew something the county in its hurry had forgotten. She had watched her grandfather Amos do it once in a lean year when a storm took half his trees. The beetle they were all so afraid of lived on the living tree. Its larvae tunneled the cambium, the thin green layer just under the bark where a tree moves its sugar and its water, and they girdled that layer until the tree starved and died. But a cut log is a dead end for a beetle that must have living wood. Any grub still in her felled trees could do nothing worse than crawl out as borers the next summer, and in a county that had cut down every orchard it owned, outdoors in January, every log in Ledford would be frozen dead. But a colonized apple log carried into a warm, damp room could be coaxed into fruit in the coldest week of the year, when a fresh mushroom would be worth whatever she asked. The oak and its shiitake plugs were only a slower bet for later, and the money this winter would ride entirely on the apple. She sorted her logs as her grandfather had taught her, apple in one row and oak in another. She had felled the trees in the cold, which was a mercy she had not planned, because wood cut in dormancy holds its bark tight and keeps the sugars the fungus would live on. She began working the logs before the cut ends could dry and let a wild fungus in ahead of her own spawn. The method was patient and physical, and there was no shortcut in any part of it. She cut the felled trunks into lengths she could lift, each about as long as her arm, because a log too heavy to move is a log you cannot tend. Into each one she drilled a grid of holes, staggered in a diamond so the spawn would run through the whole log and not race up one side and stall. Into the apple logs she tamped the sawdust oyster spawn, packing it into the holes with her thumb until the white ran to the surface. Into the oak she hammered the shiitake plugs, one to a hole, tapping them flush with the bark. Then she melted the cheese wax over a small fire and painted it hot over every hole and every cut end. Sealing the spawn inside with its moisture and locking the wild molds out, a drop of wax over each wound was the difference between a log that colonized and a log that soured. She learned to keep the seal thick and unbroken. She worked in a rhythm that ran from before light to well after it, and the labor taught her things the county notice never could. Applewood was soft and drank the wax, oak was hard and fought the drill and dulled her bits by the dozen. She kept the holes a hand's width apart down the length of each log, and a thumb's width in from the last row, staggering them so no line of spawn ran alone. She counted the holes into the oak until her shoulders burned, and the count stopped meaning anything but the next one. Word of what she was doing traveled ahead of any mushroom. At the feed store one gray afternoon, a knot of men went quiet when she came in for lamp oil, and then not quiet at all. One of Cyrus Doss's sons asked, loud enough for the room, whether she meant to sell beetle stew or beetle pie, and whether the health of the whole county was worth less to her than a stack of firewood. Della paid for her oil and told him evenly that a felled log held behind screen till the beetles had their summer could spread a beetle no farther than a burnt one could, and that if he cared why, he was welcome to read the same order she had. He did not care why. None of them did. Caring why was work, and burning was easy, and she left them to their easy answer and drove home to her logs. When the logs were plugged and waxed, she carried them to a laying yard she built in the shade on the north side of the barn, where the summer sun could not bake them and the winter wind could not strip them dry. She stacked them off the ground on old fence rails so the soil fungi could not climb in, and she left gaps for the air to move between them. Then she soaked them. A log is mostly water when it is fruiting, and the mycelium inside it will not run through dry wood. So she hauled water from the trough by the bucket and wet the stacks down and covered them with old feed sacks to hold the damp. Around the whole laying yard she then tacked a skin of fine window screen close enough that no beetle could crawl through it. So the frame held the moisture in and would hold any borer that hatched the next summer in along with it. It was the containment the county's note had demanded, and Hollis walked the screen twice that first month and marked it sound. And then, for the hardest part of the whole trade, she waited, because colonization cannot be hurried. A mushroom log keeps its secret entirely on the inside, where no one can see it work. That was where the mockery found its stride. Cyrus Doss finished burning his own orchard in 3 days and had time on his hands, and a woman stacking condemned logs in her yard instead of a fire was the best entertainment the road had offered in a year. He would slow his truck at her gate and call across that she was farming poison, that the beetle would boil out of her woodpile some spring night and take what orchards the county had left. His sons laughed, and the feed store laughed with them. The story that went around Ledford was that the Rourke girl had lost her orchard and then lost her sense, and was nursing a stack of dead beetle wood like it might sprout apples if she loved it hard enough. Della did not argue the point, because a farm is not won with arguments. She knew her stacked logs threatened no orchard in Ledford, screened behind the line and turning slowly to fungus, the only difference from the county's ashes being that her wood would still be worth something on the far side of winter. So she kept the sacks damp and the stacks shaded, and she checked the logs as a person checks bread that is proofing, not looking for a result yet, only for a sign that the living thing inside was still alive. The sign, when it came, was the wrong one first. A hard early cold snap came through in the first week of real frost, before the wax had fully cured on her latest batch. When she pulled the sacks back a few mornings later, she found trouble on 2 of the apple logs. A wild green mold had gotten in. Trichoderma, the mushroom grower's oldest enemy. A fast, bright fungus that races the spawn for the same wood and usually wins if it gets a start. It had come in through a wax seal that cracked in the cold, and it was spreading. 2 logs out of her first apple row were furred green and sour-smelling, and if she left them touching the others, the mold would jump the whole stack, and every dollar of her 62 would rot with them. She lost those too. There was no saving a log the green mold had taken. She set them apart in a screened corner of the yard to dry hard where the mold could not spread to the good stacks. And she stood over the ruin of them and made herself learn the lesson instead of only feeling it. The cold had cracked the seal. A thin coat of wax was not enough for a Ledford winter, so she went back down the rows and painted every seal a second time, thick, working the wax into every hairline she could find. She banked straw against the north side of the laying yard to keep the killing cold off the wood, and she moved the whole operation a little tighter against the barn wall where the ground held a few degrees of warmth. The failure cost her 2 logs and a week of nerve, and it bought her a method that would hold, which on a farm is a fair trade if you are honest enough to take it. After that, the logs went quiet and honest for weeks, and the waiting turned from hope into something closer to faith. Oyster mycelium is quick, and by the time the maples had dropped their last leaves, the cut ends of her apple logs had bloomed white where the spawn reached the air. It was the sign every grower waits for, the proof that the inside of the log had become one solid run of living fungus from end to end. The apple logs were her whole winter, and the question that kept her up was whether they would run clean through before the deep cold, colonized and ready to force, or whether she had plugged them a few weeks too late. The oak she had plugged with shiitake showed nothing, and would show nothing for the better part of a year, exactly as a slow bet should, and she left it alone. But knowing a thing and watching a silent woodpile through the shortest days of the year are 2 different weights to carry, and there were mornings she stood in front of the apple rows and could not tell whether she had built a business or a monument to her own stubbornness. Once, in the worst of that doubt, she took a saw to the end of a single apple log just to see. It was a gamble in itself, because cutting into a colonizing log can set it back, but she could not carry blind faith through one more empty week. She sawed a thin round off the end and held it up to the gray light, and there it was, faint but real. A pale marbling of white ran into the wood where the spawn had crept inward from the plugs. It had not stalled. It had not died. It was only slow, exactly as slow as the man at the feed store had promised. It was useless. The sight of that thin white lacing in the cut apple wood was enough to send her back to the buckets and the sacks for another month of hauling water to a woodpile the county had condemned. She waxed the fresh cut over, set the log back in its row, and told no one what she had done. The first flush came off the apple logs in the raw, wet cold of late fall, when a run of mild, damp days after the frost tricked the oyster mushrooms into fruiting. She came out one gray morning, and the ends and sides of 3 apple logs were shelved with young oyster mushrooms, pale gray and layered like a staircase, their caps still curled under, and their gills fresh and clean. She stood in the cold and looked at food growing out of wood the county had ordered burned. And for a moment the whole gamble felt like it might be true. But an early flush in wet weather is a fragile thing, and she nearly lost it by not respecting the calendar. A hard freeze was coming behind the mild days. Oyster mushrooms fruiting on a log will turn to slime the first night the water in them freezes solid, and if she left them on the logs the frost would take the whole flush before it fed anyone. So she picked in the dark by lantern the night before the freeze, cutting each cluster clean at the base, and she filled 2 baskets with the first mushrooms her dead orchard had ever grown. It was not a fortune. It was a double handful and a little more. But it was fresh food in the cold when nothing else in the county was growing, and that was the whole of the idea her grandfather had left her. She took that first basket to the Saturday market at the Grange Hall, where a scatter of farmers sold winter squash and eggs and jars of last summer's beans to a thin crowd. She set her oyster mushrooms out on a cloth and waited to be laughed at again. She was not. A woman buying eggs stopped at the pale mushrooms and asked if they were truly fresh, truly grown that week, and when Della said they were, the woman bought the lot without another word, because there was nothing else fresh on any table in the hall. The woman turned the cluster over in her hands and asked how a mushroom came to be growing in December. Della gave her the short version, that they grew on wood, that she had the orchard the county condemned, and had put it to a use nobody thought to try. The woman did not quite believe it and bought them anyway, because belief was cheaper than going without. And she promised to tell the innkeeper there was something fresh at the Grange after all. It was the first thread of the rumor that would fill Della's table by January, though she did not know it yet, standing there folding a small cloth of mushrooms into a stranger's basket in the cold. $9. It was the smallest money Della had ever been glad to take. And it was the first dollar the condemned wood had ever paid, and she drove home understanding for certain what she had only believed before. The wood would sell. She flushed the apple logs once more before the deep cold, forcing a small second crop by soaking them a day in the tub, and carried a fuller basket to the next market. That Saturday, she cleared $40 and sent 2 customers home disappointed because she had sold out before they reached the table. The oyster mushrooms were paying for feed and lamp oil already, in the depth of the year, off wood that everyone she knew had set on fire. But an easy fall flush was not the trade, and she knew it. Anyone could grow a mushroom in mild, damp weather when the wood half did it for them. The trade was growing them in the depth of January, when a fresh mushroom would be the only living green thing for 40 miles, and would be worth whatever she chose to ask. That was what the warm lean-to was for, and that was where the real money lived. A colonized log can be told when to fruit. Left alone it waits, holding its crop inside itself until something wakes it, and the oldest way to wake it is cold water. A full day and night soaking in cold water fools the log into believing a hard autumn rain has come. The season has turned, and it is time to fruit. About a week later, given warmth and damp air, the whole log flushes at once. It is a switch a patient grower can throw whenever she chooses, and Della meant to throw it in the hardest week of winter, in a place she could keep from freezing, so her mushrooms would rise while the rest of Ledford had nothing on its tables but jars and root cellars. She could not force a flush outdoors in a Ledford January. The mushrooms would freeze the first night. So through the short, dark days of December, she built the last piece of the trade with scrap and stubbornness. Against the warm south wall of the barn, where a little heat leaked from the animals inside, she framed a low lean-to and closed it with old windows and salvaged boards. It was a rough, cold frame, just big enough to stand her soaked apple logs upright in rows. She screened its single vent with the same fine mesh, so nothing could slip out of it either, and Hollis had looked the shed over and called it as tight as the yard. A single lamp and the animals' warmth through the wall kept it a few degrees above freezing on the worst nights. And a pan of water under the lamp kept the air damp as a fruiting mushroom demands. It was not a greenhouse, and it was not pretty. It was a warm, damp box in the middle of a Ledford winter, and that was exactly and only what an oyster-colonized apple log needed to be convinced that spring had come early just for it. By the middle of January, the county was locked down hard under snow, and the Grange market had shrunk to a handful of tables selling the same tired jars to the same tired neighbors. That was the week Della chose. She hauled her best colonized apple logs to a soaking tub she kept inside the screened yard, broke the ice on it, and sank the logs to soak a full day and a night in water cold enough to ache her hands through her gloves. Then she stood them upright in the warm, damp lean-to under the lamp, and she waited out the 7 longest days of the whole long year, checking the logs every few hours for the first pins. Those 7 days cost her more sleep than the whole felling had. She got up in the black cold to trim the lamp and refill the water pan and lay her palm against the wood to feel for warmth. Terrified a hard night had slipped in and frozen the flush before it began. If the shock failed, she had no fall crop left to sell and no orchard to fall back on, only a barn full of silent logs and a county that had been right about her all along. She talked to the animals through the wall to keep herself steady, and she watched the bark, and she waited. They came. On the 6th day, the apple logs showed the small pale pins a grower learns to love more than almost anything, buds pushing through the bark up and down every log. Over the next 2 days, those pins swelled into oyster mushrooms, pale gray and shelved in soft layers, their caps broad and firm and clean, exactly as a good winter flush comes up when the air around it is cold and still. She had a lean-to full of fresh oyster mushrooms in the 3rd week of January, grown on the apple logs the county had condemned to burn, while outside the snow lay on a county where nothing else fresh was growing for as far as a truck could drive. She cut them at their peak and filled every basket she owned. On Saturday, she carried the mushrooms into the Grange Hall and set them out on the same cloth where the oyster mushrooms had earned her $9 in the fall. This time, the hall stopped. Fresh mushrooms in the dead of January were a thing the people of Ledford had never once seen at their winter market, and a small crowd gathered at her table like a crowd gathers around the only warm stove in a cold room. The grocer from town, a careful man named Merle, who bought for the store and the little inn at the crossroads, worked his way to the front and picked up a mushroom and turned it over and smelled it and could not quite believe it had grown that week. "Where does a person get fresh mushrooms in January?" he said. "Grown where?" "On Applewood," Della told him. "The orchard the county told all of us to burn." Merle looked at her a long moment, and then he looked at the baskets. And then he did the arithmetic Della had done at her fence 3 months before, only his came out the other way around. "I'll take all of these," he said, "and I'll take all you can cut. Every week the snow holds. The inn wants fresh worse than the store does. There's nobody within a day's drive who can put a fresh mushroom on a plate in January but you." She sold out before the market was half over. A woman clearing the last basket asked, almost shy, how it was done, and Della told her the plain truth of it while she wrapped the mushrooms, that a beetle needs a living tree and cut wood is only wood, and that she had given her dead orchard to something that ate the wood slower and paid her back in food. The morning cleared $230 in cash and a standing weekly order on top of it, more than half a full apple season taken in a single frozen Saturday. And the winter had months left to run. The math of it turned all the way over that January. The $400 the orchard used to bring in a whole good year, she would beat before the snow was gone. On wood everyone else in Ledford had paid to burn. Merle's weekly order alone would carry her past it. The apple logs would flush again with every soaking and every spring damp crop after crop for 2 or 3 winters off a single felling, because a well-tended log keeps fruiting until the wood is finally spent, and the oak rounds she had plugged would come on behind them in their own slow years. She had not saved one crop. She had traded a dead orchard for a living trade, and it had cost her $62, 2 moldy logs, and a winter of being the fool of the county. Inspector Hollis came to the Grange Hall the last Saturday of January. He had heard, as a county always hears, and he stood at the back until the crowd thinned. Then he came up to her table with his hat in his hands, and he bought a basket of the very mushrooms his own order had condemned to the fire. "I signed the paper that killed those trees," he said. "I've signed 100 of them this winter. Yours is the only wood in the county that grew anything but ash. You signed the paper that fed the wood to me," Della said. "It only ever said the logs couldn't leave the line. It never once said I had to burn them. I just read the part nobody bothered to read." Hollis paid for his basket and did not argue, because there was nothing in it to argue. Before he left, he told her the county might lift the quarantine in the spring, once it was sure the beetle had not traveled, though her own screens would have to stand through the summer hatch either way, lifting or no. And he told her that when a man wanted to learn how to grow food on wood everyone else had given up on, he supposed her gate was the one to knock at. Then he carried his mushrooms out into the snow, and the last laugh the county had at Della Rourke went quiet for good. Cyrus Doss came to the fence in February, which she had not expected, and which cost him more than the mushrooms cost the grocer. He had burned every log he owned. His orchard was ash, and his winter was jars, same as everyone's, and across the road the Rourke girl he had, called a poison farmer, was selling fresh mushrooms to the inn and beating an apple harvest on dead wood. He stood at her gate a long while before he called her over, and when she came, he could barely get the question out. "How?" he said. It was almost the only word he had. "Every one of us burned. You kept a woodpile and it's paying you." How Della did not gloat, because her grandfather had taught her that a farm speaks for itself, and a farmer who has to crow over it never really believed in it. She let Cyrus in through the gate and walked him back to the laying yard, lifted a spent apple log from behind the screen, one that had already given its oyster crop, and turned it so he could see the white run of mycelium threaded all through the pale wood. "The beetle needs a living tree," she said. "That's the whole of it. Haul cut wood to a clean orchard and you carry the beetle with it, which is why they made us all stop moving wood. But keep the logs where they stand, behind the line, and let a fungus take the inside of them, and there's nothing left for the beetle and nowhere for it to go. Dead wood, kept behind screen until the summer hatch is come and gone with no orchard left for it to reach, is a danger to no one. Moving live wood to clean ground is. I gave mine to something that eats the wood slower than a fire does and hands you food while it works. You burned yours because the county said burn. I read what the county actually wrote, and I asked until they put it in writing." Cyrus turned the log over in his hands, and he did not laugh, and after a while he asked her, quiet, whether it was too late for a man to try it, whether a person could still start with logs cut this winter. Della told him the truth, which was that his orchard was already ash and there was nothing to be done for this year. But oak and other hardwood cut fresh next winter would take spawn as well as her apple had, she said, and if he came in the fall with clean logs and $60, she would show him how to drill and plug and wax and wait. She did not have to offer it. She offered it because a trade kept secret dies with the person keeping it, and her grandfather had handed it to her the same open manner. A county that knew how to grow food on its own dead wood was a county that would never again stand at a fence and burn its only asset because a man with a clipboard found it easier than thinking. By the time the snow went off in March, the Rourke slope had a new shape. The old orchard was gone, and Della did not pretend otherwise or grieve it longer than a farm allows. In its place stood long shaded rows of colonized logs, apple and oak, laid up off the ground on rails, some spent and pale and waiting to be retired, most still heavy with years of crops inside them. The lean-to against the barn kept forcing fresh oyster flushes through the last of the winter, and the outdoor apple logs woke on their own with the spring rain. The standing order to Merrill's store and the inn at the crossroads carried her clean into a summer with more money set by than the apples had ever left her. The laying yard became the quiet center of the farm. She learned to stagger her soakings, so a few logs were always in the lean to coming into fruit, which meant fresh mushrooms every week the road stayed open instead of a single glut and then nothing. She learned which apple logs gave up early and which would carry 2 or 3 winters of crops if she rested them between flushes, and the few oak she had plugged with shiitake began, in their own slow time, to bear. The pale gray oyster shells became as ordinary on her table as eggs, and the strangeness wore off everyone but the customers who remembered the smoke and who could not walk past her stand without saying, half to themselves, that these had come off the wood the whole county had burned. She had lost 70 trees to a beetle and a quarantine and a match the whole county was glad to strike. She had refused the match, read the order, remembered an old man's lean-eared trick, spent her last money on the gamble, buried 2 moldy logs, built a warm box out of scrap, and shocked a dead woodpile into fresh mushrooms in the coldest week of the year. The wood the county condemned had, by January, grown the only fresh food for 40 miles, and the same men who burned their own and laughed at hers came at last to her fence to learn how it was done. The truest proof came the next autumn, once the quarantine had lifted and the county was allowed to cut wood again. Cyrus Doss was the first through her gate, which no one who had heard him crowing that winter would ever have believed. He came with a truckload of fresh oak and maple off his own fence rows and $60 folded in his shirt pocket, and he stood in her laying yard with his cap in his hands while she showed him the drill, the diamond of holes, the plugs, and the hot wax. He was slow with the drill and slower to admit it, but he learned, and by dark he had his first row of logs waxed and stacked in the shade beside hers. Others came behind him that fall, 1 and 2 at a time, quiet men who had burned their orchards and did not quite know how to ask a young woman to teach them the thing they had mocked. She taught every one of them plainly and kept nothing back, because a trade only stays alive when it is given away. There is a kind of wealth that does not come from a good year or a lucky price. It comes from refusing to burn what you are told is worthless and taking the trouble to learn what it is actually good for. Della Rourke's grandfather knew it and handed it down on a stack of storm-cut logs in a lean year. She kept it alive on 70 condemned apple trees and a short row of oak, and she passed it across a fence to the man who had mocked her hardest, because a thing worth knowing is only truly saved once more than one person knows it. If you had stood at that fence in the smoke of that first burning week, holding a saw and a county order that told you to set fire to the last valuable thing you owned, and you knew what a beetle can and cannot do to cut wood, would you have struck the match with everyone else, Or would you have kept the logs and waited out the winter for the crop that no one else believed would come?